Well, good afternoon, everyone, and I welcome everyone here as we come together today for this little talk on St. Therese here at the National Shrine. How many of you have been here before on our Carmelite campus? Okay, and how many are first timers here? We'll really try to impress you today then. That's good. So, the museum here at one point was the original shrine of St. Therese before the present shrine was built, which is across the parking lot where we're having the masses today. But I'm very impressed with the collection that we have here. We have more artifacts and mementos of St. Therese than any other place in the world other than the zoo. So if you like St. Therese, you're definitely in the right spot. And this is kind of not the best time to come listen to a talk. Whenever a speaker comes to a forum, they say, "Oh, that time after lunch, that's siesta time," okay? So don't feel bad if you doze off. Please, a couple stay awake, just to keep me going, okay? But St. Therese said, I love the Blessed Mother. I have such a devotion to Mary, but I'm always falling asleep on her rosary. And I guess you can still hear me. So she says, I'm always falling asleep on the rosary. But she said, parents love their kids when they're sleeping just as much as when they're awake. Maybe more so, I don't know. So she said, I'm not going to worry about it. And so she was a woman of great confidence. Well, my name is Father David McEvoy. I'm a Carmelite priest. I work here at our provincial office in Darien. Father Carl Markels, who had the 11:30 Mass, he's our provincial. I have the job of the vice provincial. I come from our oldest Carmelite parish in the United States, which is in Leavenworth, Kansas, St. Joseph Parish. I think the mic's kind of coming in and out on us here. Anyway, 160 years ago, this particular month, in October 1864, two German Carmelites arrived by stagecoach in my hometown. They came from Straubing, Bavaria, and the Civil War was going on, so they came by a stagecoach across northern Missouri. They came out to the Kansas frontier because there were a lot of German immigrants there. So that was my hometown. And I grew up in the Carmelite parish, and I really had a childhood devotion to St. Therese even before I made my first communion. And I really think I'm a Carmelite today because St. Therese. And I think, I could say I love St. Therese a lot. I'm sure many of you do too. And what started my devotion to her is she always answered prayers. She says you're going to let this cascade of roses come down. And whether it's a big intention or a little intention, she listens to you. So when I was in first grade, my intention was help me on this arithmetic test. And then if I forgot, I didn't get so good grades. But when I remembered, I did well. And when I was looking for my first job, I was getting very discouraged. This is before I entered the seminary. I prayed to the little flower. The next day, I got the call. So she's a strong patroness. Okay, this is the point of my talk today. When we look at the basic facts of St. Therese's life, we ask the question, how did this young woman living in the late 19th century France become what Pope St. Pius X called the greatest saint in modern times? So that's the question I lay out to you. So just a little bit about her, first of all, and then ask yourself that question, well, how did she become so famous? Marie-Françoise Thérèse Martin, she was born on January the 2nd, 1873 in Alençon, France. That was actually the same year my own grandfather was born. She was the youngest of 9 children, born to her parents, Louis and Zélie Grain Martin. Her father was 49 and her mother was 41 when Therese was born. 2 of her older brothers and an older sister had died in infancy, and she also lost a little sister that was 5 years old. Therese was raised with her 4 older sisters, Marie, Pauline, Léonie, and Céline. So when Therese's mother, Zélie, died of breast cancer at the age of 45, Therese was only 4 years old. Her father, Louis, became a single father, devoted to rearing his 5 daughters in a Catholic home. And in less than 3 months, he picked up and left their town of Alençon, and he moved to the town of Lisieux, which is where his wife had a brother and family living. These were really Therese's and her sister's only real relatives in France at the time. So he wanted them to be able to be close to that family. And of course, then perhaps the coincidence that there was a cloistered Carmelite convent in the hometown of Lisieux, which would play a big part in her life. Now, for 5 years, age 8 to 13, Therese received her elementary education at Benedictine school. Her sisters went there as boarding students, but Therese didn't. She hated the school so much that she eventually was homeschooled. And she never received what we would call a high school diploma or any kind of an advanced degree. And yet she's a doctor of the church. At the age of 15, Therese received the unique permission of entering the Carmelite cloister in Lisieux, and she joined her 2 older sisters who were already in the convent, Marie and Pauline. She lived the hidden life of a cloistered nun, 9 years, dying of tuberculosis on September the 30th, 1897, at the age of 24. So now, if you doze off, you've heard the whole story of Therese right there. Now, as we review the basic facts of her life, we ask the question, well, what was so remarkable about her life that she would be not only getting the accolades of St. Pius X, but she was a canonized saint only 28 years after her death. And then 100 years after her death, she was named a doctor of the church by Pope St. John Paul II. So to answer this question, I'm going to look at 3 elements of her life. First of all, the influence of her parents, 2 significant events in her childhood, and then what were these spiritual insights that she wrote in her autobiography that made her so famous. But at the very end, I'll give you what I think the reason is she's so famous. Okay, a little bit about her parents. The parents of Therese, Louis Martin and Marie Azélie Guérin Martin, they were canonized as a couple by Pope Francis on October the 18th, 2015. Now, having parents who are canonized saints, even though they were canonized 90 years after the canonization of their popular daughter, without a doubt would cause us to, well, take a good look at them, okay? Now, Louis was born on August 22nd, 1823 in the town of Bordeaux, France. He was the 3rd of 5 children, but all his siblings died before he was 30. When he was a boy of 7, the family moved to this town of Alençon, where Therese would eventually be born, in Normandy. And this section of France is very close to the D-Day beaches that we oftentimes hear about here in the United States. Now, at the age of 19, he became a watchmaker apprentice with his father's cousin. If you look over here at the shrine, you'll see that kind of tower as you first entered the sidewalk, and there's a clock up there. Well, there's clocks everywhere in churches, but that particular clock was put there to honor Louis because he was a watchmaker. Now, at an early age in his manhood, he thought he was called to have the vocation of a priest, but he was unable to master Latin. So he decided, well, he'd stick with a career as a watchmaker. He opened up a jewelry shop in Alençon, and he purchased this little kind of hexagonal tower at the end of town because he always had this kind of I would say, a withdrawal, a sense of withdrawal. He wanted to kind of have a place he could go and pray and read and reflect. And it was in that tower that he got this statue, which was later very famous in the life of Therese, of Our Lady of Victories, Our Lady of the Smile. But he was the one who got that, put in his little tower. This is before he was married. There's a replica of it here in the museum. Now, he met his future wife, Zélie, in May 1858. They were crossing a little bridge in Alençon. Now, he was 35, she was 27. Apparently, it was love at first sight. They got married in 3 months' time. Like, no priest would do that to you today, right? But they're canonized saints, so it can work out, right? So they were married on July the 13th, 1858, and their joint feast day today is July the 12th, the day before their wedding anniversary. Now, Zélie was born December of 1831, a few miles from Alençon. She had one sister, Elise, who became a visitation nun, and a brother, Isidore, who became a pharmacist. And it was this brother who moved to Lisieux and would play a role in the life of the Martin family. Zélie at one time wanted to become a religious, but the nun says you're not healthy enough, so she gave that up. She had a very successful lace-making business. Now, the lace from Alençon was very popular among the wealthy people in Paris. And this was her great gift. She was great at doing this lace. And she was so successful that after their marriage, Louis gave up his job to work for her. Now, that doesn't happen too much today, right? When the husband gives up his work for the wife, but that's what they did. Now, she was the primary breadwinner for the family. And in the next 13 years, she was to have 9 children, an extraordinary lady. Okay, the first 3 daughters all lived into adulthood. There was Marie, born in 1860. She died, well, shortly before her 80th birthday in 1940. Pauline was born in 1861, and she lived to 1951. She was 90 years old. And then the third daughter, Leonie, was born in 1863. She died in 1941. There have been books written on her. She was sort of the ugly duckling of the family. She had learning disabilities. Her mother had a hard time dealing with her, and she was the only one that didn't become a Carmelite sister in the zoo. She entered another convent after about 4 attempts. Now, after those 3 daughters, the next 3 children all died in infancy or young age. Helene was born in 1864, but she was 5 years old when she died. So 5 years old is a little different than somebody who might just be a newborn baby. Then there were 2 boys, Joseph and Jean-Baptiste. They both died within a year of their birth. Then came the final 3 daughters, Celine, who was the closest to Therese growing up, and she lived to be 90. She died in 1959. Then there was a little girl named Melanie, who died shortly after her birth. And finally, Therese, the youngest, the 9th children, born in 1873. She died at the age of 24. Now, Zilly mourned the loss of her 4 children who died young, worried about the health of her remaining children, raised her girls, maintained the family home, worked to exhaustion in the lace-making business. She was unable to breastfeed her later children, and this was before formula. So if you couldn't breastfeed a baby, somebody would have to do it. So they would have what they called a wet nurse, and they would send the baby out into the country to some lady who would nurse the baby for a year. And this was somewhat difficult, obviously, for Zilly. And of course, that's what she did with her daughter, Therese. Zilly contracted incurable breast cancer. She died August 28, 1877, at the age of 45. And this left Louis, the widower, at 54 with 5 daughters. Therese was 4, Celine was 8, the other girls were 14, 16, and 17. So focusing on what was going to be the best thing for the children, he picked up within 3 months, moved to the town of Lisieux, where his brother-in-law was a pharmacist, and at least the girls had 2 cousins who would be able to give them some companionship. Now, I wonder if he had any idea when he moved to Lisieux that this convent that just happened to be in the town would play such a huge part in the life of his children. He took up the role of a single father. It was a vocation in which he really excelled. He had a great love of nature. He'd often take Therese with him fishing. And this mural that we have here, you can take a look when you leave. There's a picture of Therese out there with her dad, and he's fishing, and she's just sort of enjoying all the nature scenes of her native Normandy. Louis also had an impulse for withdrawal and silence, and so I kind of wondered, was this passed down to his daughters? Maybe so. In the family home in Les Buissonnettes, he had a little room at the attic at the top of the house, and it was what I would call a spiritual man cave, okay? So he'd go up there, and the girls could not enter unless they wanted to talk about some spiritual topic. Maybe just need to get away from the 5 girls, but at any rate, that's what he did. And it had an impact on them. Now, he used to see in his lifetime 3 of his 5 daughters enter the Carmelite cloister. The first to enter was Pauline. She was the second daughter. At the 21, she entered the convent. Then the oldest daughter, Marie, when she was 28, and then Therese when she was only 15. Leonie, after a few unsuccessful months with the Poor Clares, she entered the Sisters of Visitation where her aunt was, but it took her 3 tries to make it work. Louis said, "It was the greatest honor for me that the good Lord desires to take all my children. If I had anything better, I would not hesitate to offer it to him." Now, shortly after Therese entered the convent in Lisieux, she went into the convent April the 9th in 1888, Louis began to show signs of a mental breakdown. And he basically ran away from home. They didn't know where he was. The other daughters went out searching for him. And the people in the town said, well, he's having this psychosis or this breakdown because his heart was broken that Therese entered the convent. So I don't think that was really true, but that gossip was very difficult for Therese in the convent to deal with. He had disappeared from his home, and when he was discovered, he seemed very unconcerned, and he started giving a lot of money away to the church. So if you ever do that, you'll be committed to an asylum, because that's what happened to him. Anyway, he first, he was able to at least be able to be with Therese when she first entered the convent. And in January of 1889, so she's been in the convent, what we call a postulant, for about 9 months. She entered the novitiate. And so the Carmelite cloister, what they did, a young girl entering the novitiate would wear a complete bridal gown. Okay, so she had this beautiful bridal gown with the Alençon lace that her mother had made, and her father walked her up the aisle. And then, she'd go into the cloister, they'd cut her hair and put the habit on, and then she'd come out. And this was an event that he was able to be present for and gave Therese a lot of consolation. But just 1 month after this ceremony, he was admitted to a psychiatric hospital, and he was there for 3 years. They sold the family home, Les Buissonnettes. And once his health declined after a number of strokes, and they know, well, he's not going to run away from home, they brought him back to Lisieux, and so he actually died in the hometown where his daughters were. Again, when you look at this relief over here, you'll see a man in a wheelchair, and the sisters, they were able to see him in the convent once before he died. Now, just 6 weeks after the dad died, what did Celine do? I think I'll enter the Carmelite convent in Lisieux, like her 3 old sisters. And when she came into the convent, she brought a camera. And the reason we have all these photographs of the little flower, which you can see in this part of the museum, is because Celine brought her camera, and she took lots of pictures of her sister. Now, as we reflect on Therese's parents, we see them very much as models of the married life. They were canonized as a couple. So just to sum up what their virtues were, we'd say, well, they loved each other. They put each other first, the fact that Louis gave up his profession. They raised their kids with great love. They respected their individualities. They inspired them with a real faith. But at the same time, they didn't have an easy go of it either. They lost 4 children. Zélie died at the age of 45 of cancer, and then Louis had this mental breakdown, dementia, and paralysis. But through the whole time of their life, their Catholic faith was the center of things. And that was the great gift that they gave to Therese. I always tell this story, if you heard me give this part of this talk last year, I find this an interesting insight. When kids are making their confirmation, they have to choose a confirmation name. Anybody here have the confirmation name of Therese or Therese? Anybody? There you go. Okay. Well, this little girl that was in the 8th grade when I was in the parish in Kansas, she took the name of Zélie because that's the mother of St. Therese, and she's beatified, being canonized. Well, then she had to write a letter to the bishop. Now, the pastor always holds their breath when kids write a letter to the bishop. I had one student say, I want my sponsor to be a dog. I like my dog. Well, more catechesis for that one, right? But anyway, Mary Claire Peterson, she had a lovely statement when she wrote to the bishop. She said, Louis and Zélie were not canonized saints on the coattails of their famous daughter, Therese. But Saint Therese is a saint because of her parents, Louis and Zélie. So those of you who are parents, there's something to aim for, okay? So that's the first part of why I would say Therese is a saint. Now we're going to look at some significant events from her point of view in her childhood. Okay, reflecting on her childhood, Therese stated that she could really divide her entire life into 3 periods. And, I don't think any biographer of hers would make these the 3 periods, but this is the first period of her life was while her mother was alive. So the first 4.5 years of her life. The second period, for the next 10 years, she was extremely sensitive young girl. And we might say too sensitive. And then she had what she called a Christmas conversion, where she turned into an adult. And then that took her from the age of 14 for the rest of her life. So we'll look at these different periods of her life. Okay, she's born on January the 2nd, 1873, and they baptized her 2 days later. Her mother was constantly worried, having lost already 4 children, that something would go wrong. So they baptized her right away. And she was named, in English, we'd say her name was Mary Frances Therese. She was plagued by her mother, the 4 earlier children. She wasn't able to nurse Therese. So from March, after the baby's birth in January, to April of the next year, she went to a wet nurse in the country. And this was very difficult for her mother. And one would think it was a little difficult for the baby too, because one time she came to visit, and of course she didn't recognize her mother, and she wasn't wanting to go to her. So anybody who's a mother out there would know that would be kind of painful. Therese was a high-strung child, and her mother wrote, this is a quote that Zélie wrote, "I have to correct this poor baby. He goes into a terrible rage when things don't go as she likes. She rolls around on the floor like a desperate person believing all is lost." However, this is her mom, she's quite cute, very intelligent, and remembers everything. So right from the beginning, Therese had a strong constitution. Well, tragedy struck when her mother died of breast cancer, July the 29th, 1877. And Therese wrote about this. She said, "The day of Mama's departure, or the day after, Father took me in his arms and said, 'Come kiss your poor little mother for the last time.' Without a word, I placed my lips on her forehead. I don't recall having cried very much. Neither did I speak to anyone about the feelings I experienced. I looked and listened in silence. No one had any time to pay any attention to me, and I saw many things they would have hidden from me." That was the memory of her mother's death. And later she said, "Oh, how quickly those sunny years pass, those years of my childhood, but what a sweet imprint they have made on my soul." That being said, in the very early and painful loss of her mother, Therese perceived something very important about life. And that is, life in this world is transitory. And growing up in a faithful family, she had her eyes set on heaven because of this loss. So that was perhaps the gift that she got from this painful event. Okay, then Therese went through 10 years of what we would say hypersensitivity. Okay, so were any of you extra sensitive as children? Am I the only one? My dad said, "You're too sensitive about these things." Anyway, within 3 months of Zélie's death, as we said, Louis moved the girls to this new home in the zoo, and their house was called Les Buissonnettes. I don't speak French, but Les Buissonnettes just means the bushes. And again, that shows up in this wooden mural. And they were getting closer to some relatives, and Therese said, "I experienced no regret whatsoever at leaving Alençon. Children are fond of change, and it was with pleasure that I came to Lisieux." And of course, this move had the additional effect, I keep saying, there was a cloistered Carmelite convent around the turn in the street. Now, after the death of her mother, Therese entered a period of 10 years she's plagued by hypersensitivity. She said, "My happy disposition completely changed after Mama's death. I once, so full of life, became timid and retiring, sensitive to an excessive degree. One look was enough to reduce me to tears, and the only way I was content was to be left alone completely. I could not bear the company of strangers and found my joy only with the intimacy of my family." So in the protective family circle, she was great. Put her out of that, she wasn't very happy. She loved the companionship of her dad, Louis. She said, "I was very fond of the countryside, flowers, birds, etc. I tried to fish with my little line, but I preferred to go alone and sit down on the grass bedecked with flowers, and then my thoughts became very profound indeed." I remember she once referred to herself as the little flower, and that was because she's looking out in this meadow, and she sees some little flower that's beautiful, but no one knows it's there, but she knows God knows it's there. And that's where she got this beginning of her spirituality that, you know, God knows who I am. I don't have to be some famous great saint. Okay. Now, with the death of her mother, Therese chose her sister Pauline to be her second mother. Marie was like, okay, I'll be the surrogate mother for Celine, and Pauline was the surrogate mother for Therese. And they homeschooled Therese until she was 8, and then she went to this Benedictine Abbey school. Well, Therese, let's face it, she hated her school experience. She didn't adjust well at all. Part of the problem was she was smarter than her peers, and they put her in a group of older children and still smarter than them. So she didn't fit in very well. She was incapable of socializing with the other students. She was bullied by the older girls and found it hard to be outside the safety of her family home. Now, Therese stated, this is her quote, "I've often heard it said that the time spent in school is the best and happiness of one's life. It wasn't that way for me. The 5 years I spent in school were the saddest in my life. I had a happy disposition, but I didn't know how to enter into games of my age level. Often during the recreations, I leaned against a tree and studied my companions at a distance, giving myself up to serious reflections." Not really fitting in with the other girls, is she? Okay. I wasn't a very pleasant companion. I did my best, however, to imitate, but without much success. I was very much bored by it all. Okay. Now, in October the 2nd, 1882, Therese's sister Pauline enters the Carmelite convent. Okay. Therese was 9 years old. This was kind of her surrogate mother in the family. And at first she was kind of excited that Pauline was becoming a Carmelite. She said, "I wanted Carmel as soon as I learned of it. All the aspirations of my heart are fulfilled in this order." That's what we need on all our vocation posters from the Carmelites, okay? But having lost her mother, and now her sister, she's going to lose her going into the convent, she said, "Pauline is lost to me almost in the same manner as if she were dead." It's kind of gruesome, huh? So the same day Pauline left for the convent, Therese had to return to the Benedictine school. Now, 6 months after this, Therese went into what we call a depression. She was seized by nervous trembling, had attacks of fear and hallucinations. She couldn't be left alone. Her father and sisters became increasingly worried and thought she was going to die. Louis had a novena of masses said for her in Paris. No one has ever said what this was, but she was becoming anorexic and she had these like mini seizures, and having lost already 4 other children, obviously they were worried. Well, on May the 13th of that year, on Pentecost Sunday, Therese was seized with a more violent attack than before. Family gathered around her bed thinking she's going to die. But in her bedroom was that statue of the Blessed Mother, Our Lady of Victories. There's a copy there, and there'll be a copy in the room there. That's the like Therese's cell. And in the middle of this situation where they thought she was going to die, Therese looked at the statue, and the Blessed Mother smiled at her for about 4 or 5 minutes. Now, no one can prove that the statue smiled at her, but she believed that Mary smiled at her, and then she was totally cured of whatever this psychosomatic episode was. So having lost, it wouldn't have to be a big psychologist. You lost your mother. First you were with the wet nurse, and then you lost your mother, and then you lost your substitute mother. Well, the Blessed Mother came through for her as her mother, okay? And she said, "All my pain disappeared." So that would probably be the best explanation we can give for that. Now, one day, of course, in the not so distant future, the Carmelite order is dedicated to Mary. So there's another connection why Therese would become a Carmelite. Okay, the following year in 1884, Therese received her first Holy Communion on May the 8th. And you had to be a certain age to get receive your first Holy Communion. So she would have been, I think, 11. And you had to be that age by January 1st. So she wanted to do it the year before because her birthday was January the 2nd. And the family even went to the bishop and said, rules are rules. So Therese had to wait to get her first Holy Communion. And in that same year, she got her confirmation. Now, finally, her time in the school with the Benedictine sisters just got worse. And because of her behavior, she would be first in her class, okay? But maybe she wouldn't get an A on a certain test, and she'd burst into tears. And the kids called her the mourner because she was never happy there. Finally, after her 13th birthday, her dad said, "Oh, enough is enough." Took her out of that school, and she was homeschooled, okay? Now, Therese wrote about her extreme sensitivity, which continued until what she called her Great Christmas Conversion of 1866. So this is just a little episode. It's talked about when you look over here on this part of the museum where they have the staircase. And she said this starts the final time of her life. And she says, I was really unbearable because of my extreme touchiness. She said it happened to cause, if I happened to cry, because then I feel bad that I caused somebody distress. And then when I quit crying, I cried because I did cry. And well, it was a problem. Well, it was a simple event, Christmas Eve, 1886. It was just right before her 14th birthday. She's 13 years old. So what happened was, and we can listen to her own words here, but they came home from midnight mass, all right? And it was a custom, like we would put out maybe stockings or something for Santa Claus. And so she had her shoes out there, and they put little candies and stuff there. And then, she'd go and open it up in front of her father. But the problem was her dad was exhausted. And she heard him say, well, I guess this will be the last year. Hopefully this is the last year. And as sensitive as she was, it was like putting a knife in her heart, because her father was the one that was closest to her. And now he's also sees that, she's wanting, she would say. Well, this is how she described it. We come back from midnight mass where I had the happiness of receiving the strong and powerful God. Upon arriving at Les Buissonnettes, I used to love to take my shoes from the chimney corner and examine the presents in them. This old custom had given us so much joy in our youth that Celine wanted to continue treating me as a baby since I was the youngest in the family. Papa had always loved to see my happiness and listen to my cries of delight as I drew each surprise from the magic shoes, and my dear king's gaiety increased my own happiness very much. However, Jesus desired to show me that I was to give up the defects of my childhood, and so he withdrew its innocent pleasures. This is how she interpreted it. He permitted Papa, tired out after the midnight mass, like 1:30 or 2 in the morning, right, to experience annoyance when seeing my shoes at the fireplace. And then he speak those words which pierced my heart. Well, fortunately, this'll be the last year. I was going upstairs at the time to remove my hat, and Celine, knowing how sensitive I was, and seeing the tears already glistening in my eyes, wanted to cry too, for she loved me very much and understood my grief. She said, oh, Therese, don't go downstairs. It would cause you too much grief to look at your slippers right now. But, now she's referring to herself in the third person, but Therese was no longer the same. Jesus had changed her heart. Forcing back my tears, I descended the stairs rapidly, controlling the pounding of my heart. I took my slippers and placed them in front of Papa and withdrew all the objects joyfully. I had the happy appearance of a queen. And having regained his own cheerfulness, Papa was laughing. Celine believed it was a dream. Fortunately, it was a sweet reality. Basically, and we would just say, Therese, learn to say, I'm going to suck it up, okay? I've been insulted, but I'm not going to let my emotions ruin the evening. And she went down and she took control of herself. That's the best way I could explain it. Fortunately, it was a sweet reality. Therese had discovered once again the strength of soul, which she had lost at the age of 4.5. She was to preserve it forever. On that night of light began the third period of my life, the most beautiful and most filled with graces from heaven. Now, what seems to us as such an insignificant event, Therese saw as the number one turning point of her entire life. She referred to it as the night of her conversion. She said, on the very night that Jesus became a little child, she became an adult. And as an adult, she began to plan her adult life that lay ahead of her. She said, he transformed me in such a way that I no longer recognized myself. He made me strong and courageous. I felt charity or love enter into my soul and the need to forget myself and to please others. And since then, I've been happy. So, now what took place? Well, within 15 months, Therese was to enter the convent. She started her big campaign to enter the cloister of Lisieux when she was only 15 years old. Okay? Now, first she went to talk to her dad. Well, he was kind of shocked that she would want to, she was 14, but she convinced him that's what she needed to do. Then an event came up which showed that she had an interest outside her home. There was this horrible criminal by the name of Henry Pranzini. He had murdered 2 women and a young girl in Paris, and he was going to be executed with capital punishment. And so Therese decided she would pray for him, that he would convert. It was in the papers. He would have nothing to do with the priest. He wouldn't convert. But Therese had a mass said for him, and she prayed night and day. And then finally, she read in the newspaper that right before he went to the guillotine, he grabbed the priest's crucifix and kissed it 3 times. And she said, my prayer had an effect. And she felt that through her prayer to the Lord and her sacrifices, she could bring conversion to sinners. And that's what was the basis of her life in a convent. I mean, why would you lock yourself up in a convent and never come out? She never left that convent physically from the day she went in, unless she thought what you're doing had some purpose. And that event of this criminal kissing the cross as he went to have his head chopped off was really inspired her. Now, on October the 31st of that same year, she took a train to Bayeux with her father to meet the bishop. And she was trying to get his permission to enter the convent. And you've seen this picture of Therese when she's 14. She has her hair up, the hair up on top of her head. She did that so she'd look older. She's trying to look like she's 18 when she's only, at this point, 14. Well, the bishop said, I think you're too young, okay? Then the next thing that happened, the father decided to take his 2 daughters on a pilgrimage to Rome. And whether he was doing that to distract her, we don't know. But Therese was focused on the fact that on this pilgrimage to Rome, which was a pilgrimage in honor of Pope Leo XIII on the 50th anniversary of his priesthood, that she was going to get the Pope to give her permission to enter the convent. That sounds like a 14-year-old kid, right? Well, the bishop won't do it. I'll go to the Pope, all right? Which is what she did. Now, they left on November the 4th by train, and they didn't come back till December the 2nd. And they went to some lovely places. They went through Switzerland, Milan, Venice, Padua, Bologna, Rome. On the way back, Florence, Genoa, Nice, Marseille, Lyon, Paris, and back to Lisieux. But she was just focused on, I'm going to get into this convent. So on Sunday, November the 20th, 1887, the pilgrims had their long-awaited audience with the Pope. And they said, okay, this is this group from France. You're going to go up and meet the Pope and just, kiss his ring, say nothing, and move on. That's what you're supposed to do. So Therese just said, well, I'm not doing any of that, right? So what she did is she rushed up and knelt down before Leo XIII, and she said, in honor of your 50th Jubilee, give me permission to enter the Carmelite cloister in Lisieux. And Leo XIII, you can see the image up there, he was an old man at the time. He just said, what? And the priest that was next to him, the Monsignor, said, well, she wants to enter this convent. And he just says, well, if God wills it, you'll enter. Very smart Pope, no commitment. Therese created a scene. Now, even though she had her conversion, they had to drag her off crying. And this is what she said. The Pope is so old that one would say he is dead. I would have liked to be able to explain my business, which she didn't get to do. Now, I've heard about this story, forever, but what I didn't know is that it created such a scene, it ended up in the newspaper, okay? So it was a French newspaper, L'Univers, and there was a column about what's going on in Rome, and this article was published. It said, among the pilgrims was a young girl of 15 who asked the Holy Father for permission to enter a convent immediately in order to become a religious there. Now, whether this is true or not, he said, His Holiness urged her to be patient, to pray much, to consult God and her conscience as well, which made the young enthusiast burst into tears. So it was a real scene there. Now, returning to Lisieux, well, she just hoped that somehow maybe her entreaty to the bishop would come through. I have heard, it's not really documented anywhere, that while they were in Rome, Louis went to talk to some Monsignor from France who was a friend of the bishop, and well, eventually on January the 1st, the day before her 15th birthday, a letter came through from the bishop and said, okay, you can enter the convent at the age of 15. But then her sister kind of put the brakes on it for a little bit because her sister in the convent said it's so cold. There's no heat in the convent, but for one room. And the Lenten austerities were so strict that maybe better wait till the spring. So in the spring, she ended up entering the convent. And her father gave her a blessing as she entered. To give it to me, he placed himself on his knees and blessed me, tears flowing down his cheeks. It was a spectacle to make the angels smile. This spectacle of an old man presenting his child, still in the springtime of life, to the Lord. And she said, in a few moments later, the doors opened, and she was received by her two blood sisters at that time. Okay, certainly the influence of her parents and the events of her first 15 years of her life brought Therese at such a young age to the Order of Carmel. But what was it that caused Therese to become a great saint, a doctor of the church? To understand the rest of the story, we'll turn to her life in the convent. We take a deep breath. Is everybody with me? We're down to the third part here of her life. What happened when she got to the convent? Well, as I said, she entered in April, and then in January had this ceremony where she wore a wedding dress and received the habit. But we might ask ourselves, what was life like each day for Therese in the convent? So what was her daily life like? So there's two pieces to this final stage. What was she doing every day? And then what was some of her great spiritual insights while she was doing these things? Prayer occupied 6.5 hours of the day, with 2 hours in silent prayer, 4.5 hours to daily mass and the liturgy of the hour, a half hour each day for personal spiritual reading, 5 hours each day devoted to work done in solitude, like in the laundry, the sacristy, the garden, altar breads, etc. 2 hours for communal recreation. Meals were held in silence in the common refectory. And then in the evening before the grand silence, the sisters were given an hour of free time. Now, this is the part I found a bit extraordinary. During the summer, the nuns got 6 hours of sleep, but you got an hour of siesta in the afternoon. In the winter, you got 7 hours of sleep. So this was the horarium, the schedule for the day. Get up in the morning at 4:45 and show up in choir at 5. Office of the Liturgy of the Hours, 7 o'clock Mass, 8 o'clock breakfast, 8:15 work, 9:50 examination of conscience, and the main meal was at 10 a.m., fish, eggs, vegetables, cheese, and fruit. For the most part, they were vegetarians. Then some nuns had to do dishes, the rest had a little bit of recreation. In the afternoon, spiritual reading. At 3 o'clock, a bell was rung to recall the hour of Christ's death. Each sister was to kneel down, kiss the ground, and then kiss her crucifix. More work until 5 when there was mental prayer, a little supper at 6, more dishes to do, recreation, free time at 8 o'clock. You could say the rosary with your free time. And then prayer and choir at 9 o'clock and 10:30 retire for the night. So this is a pretty rigorous schedule. So while Therese was maturing as a young woman and a young Carmelite nun, following this rigorous schedule, she was experiencing profound spiritual insights. And the reason we're even aware of Therese's insights in this hidden life of Carmel was that her superiors at one point instructed her to write down her childhood memories and aspects of her spirituality. So this is key. So, when she died, one of the nuns said, well, we don't have enough to put in her obituary. What are they going to say about Therese? She didn't accomplish anything. But because her sister, who was the mother of the superior of the convent, at one point asked her to write down her memoirs, that's how we get her spiritual testimony. And that's why the Pope said she's a doctor of the church, because her experiences are so focused on the gospel that they're a wonderful way to lead people to Christ. So she really wrote 3 different manuscripts. She wrote the first one when she was 22, the second one when she was 23, and the third one when she was dying of tuberculosis at 24. Speaking about her early life, she said, I found religious life to be exactly as I had imagined it. No sacrifice astonished me, and yet, as you know, dear mother, my first steps met with more thorns than roses. She said, I came to save souls and especially to pray for priests. Now, many times there were misunderstandings in the convent. Okay, so you have this group of women, probably like 20, 25 women, and you're with them for the rest of your life, okay? So, sometimes 2 women in the kitchen are too many, right? So, I don't know, they say that. But at any rate, she oftentimes had issues with some of the other sisters. And we'll talk about that here in just a little bit. She basically, you've heard her say her vocation was love. She said one time, in the heart of the church, I'll be loved. When her relics came in the 1990s to the United States, that was like 30 years before we had them here last year. Okay, I was the novice director in Middletown, New York. Went to St. Patrick's Cathedral. And here you are in this busy Manhattan, this beautiful photograph of St. Therese on the outside of the cathedral. And it says, in the heart of the church, I will be loved. That's one of her statements. Well, how did she come up with that? Well, she said, she's talking to Jesus. She said, I'm your spouse. I'm a Carmelite. I'm supposed to bring other souls to you. So in a way, I'm a mother. And these three privileges sum up my vocation. But she said, I'm restless about it. She said, I'd like to be a warrior, a priest, an apostle, a missionary, a martyr. The Sisters in the Zoo founded another convent in Hanoi, in Vietnam. And she thought maybe that she would get to go to that convent, but her health wasn't strong enough. So we might ask, was she just so pinned in the convent that she was getting restless? Well, at any rate, she had a great insight looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 12 and 13. Okay, if you remember St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians, he talks about there are different gifts that build up the church. So your gift and my gift and your gift are different, but they're all important. And he uses the analogy of the body. It says, like, if the nose wants to be the foot, it wouldn't make any sense. And if the hand wanted to be the mouth, it wouldn't be. But then when Therese looked at this, she said, he's missing the most important body part, and that's the heart. He never said anything about the heart. So she came to this idea, because then as she kept reading in chapter 13, that, the greatest of all gifts is love, that she said, well, that's going to be my vocation. My vocation is love. Because what good would there be if the church didn't have a heart? And of course, her vocation in the convent is praying for everybody in the church. So, so this was her insight. She said, I understood it was love alone that made the church's members act, that if love became extinct, apostles would not preach the gospel, martyrs would not shed their blood. I understood that love comprised all vocations, that love was everything, and that it embraced all times and places, and in a word, it was eternal. So in my great joy, I cried out to Jesus, my vocation is love. I have found my place in the church. So it was a great insight for her. Okay, now a little situation with one of the sisters in the community. She said, there is in the community a sister who has the faculty of displeasing me in everything. In her ways, her words, her character, everything seems very disagreeable to me. Okay, not really the one you want your best friend. And still, she's a holy religious who must be pleasing to God. And not wishing to give in to my natural antipathy I was experiencing, I told myself that charity must not consist in feelings, but in works. So we're going back to the Christmas conversion. It's not all about your feelings, but what you do with them. So then I set myself doing for this sister with what I would do for the person I love the most. Each time I met her, I prayed to God for her, offering him all her virtues and merits. I felt this was pleasing to Jesus, for there's no artist who doesn't love to receive praise for his works. And Jesus, the artist of souls, is happy when we don't stop at the exterior, but penetrate into the inner sanctuary where he chooses to dwell. We admire its beauty. I wasn't simply content with praying for this sister who gave me so many struggles, but I took care to render her all the services possible. And when I was tempted to answer her back in a disagreeable manner, I was content with giving her my most friendly smile and with changing the subject of conversation. So she said frequently in the recreation, she'd see the nun and she'd just want to run away, right? But at one point, one day when they're having recreation, the crusty old nun says to Therese, Sister Therese, what attracts you so much toward me? Every time you look at me, I see you smile. She says, oh, what attracted me was Jesus, hidden in the depths of her soul. Jesus who makes sweet what is most bitter. I answered I was smiling because I was happy to see her. But understood, I did not add, it was from a spiritual standpoint. She says, we don't have any enemies in Carmel, but there are feelings, and one feels attracted to one sister, whereas with regard to another, you'd make a long detour in order to avoid meeting her. And so without even knowing it, she becomes a subject of persecution. So Jesus is telling me it is this sister who must be loved. Okay, now just to sum up her basic spirituality here as we come to toward the end. Therese is known for her spirituality of the little way. So of all of her insights, none is more central than what we would call today the little way. Therese believes she was called to be a great saint, but she'd only become a great saint by remaining little and allowing the Lord to bring her to holiness. She only needed to remain herself, like a little flower in the meadow that only God would recognize to attain the glory of her vocation. She said, I didn't always understand the realities of life, but soon God made me feel that true glory is that which will last eternally. So he's talking about going to heaven. And to reach it, it isn't necessary to perform striking works, but to hide oneself and practice virtue. And she loved to look at the life of Joan of the Arc, St. Joan of Arc. And but she said when she looked at these great saints, the difference between them and her was like the top of a mountaintop to the bottom of the hill. But she said, really, what I'm going to do is just let God take me in my littleness and raise me up. She had this wonderful quote. She said, we're living in modern times. And she says, we don't have to take the trouble of climbing stairs because we have elevators. And she said, you just push a button and go up. So I'm not going to be like John of the Cross and have to have this arduous trip to get to heaven. I'm going to push the button, and Jesus in his arms, he's the one that's going to bring me up. So this is really the heart of Therese. She says, you can't have too much confidence in the good Lord. So if I fall asleep, he loves me anyway, okay? And I'm going to push the button, and Christ will be my elevator, okay? The elevator which must raise me to heaven is your arms, O Jesus, and for this I had no need to grow up, but rather I had to remain little and become this more and more. So finally, just a little bit about Therese's final illness and death. On the Holy Thursday of 1896, so this is about 18 months before she died, she threw up blood. She had a hemorrhage. And so she knew that she was contracting tuberculosis. Now, it would have been the worst possible environment if you had tuberculosis, right? So people with tuberculosis would go to an arid climate where they'd be dry. In the United States, you go to Arizona. So she wasn't in the best situation for that. And not only did she have this terrible physical illness, but she lost the experience that God was close to her. So it's kind of what we call the dark night of the soul. That's what John of the Cross, that's what this whole window is about here, is the dark night of the soul that eventually leads us to the resurrection. And she said, I can't even say that I believe, but I want to believe. And her death was very agonizing because she said, she was in so much pain, and she told the nuns, well, take all the medication away from my bedside, because I might be tempted if I didn't have faith to commit suicide. So Therese, who's this great saint, experienced everything we did. Now remember, Mother Teresa of Calcutta went through the same thing before she died. Look at these saints, oh my gosh, if they have problems, what's going to happen to us, right? But she really struggled with that, with this dark night of the soul. She said, how will this story of a little white flower come to an end? Now she wrote this actually before she got sick, but we'll listen to it. Perhaps the little flower will be plucked in her youthful freshness and be transplanted to other shores. That's where I was wrong, it's the Carmel of Saigon, not Hanoi, where she was hoping to go. So that could happen, she said, or, that God may take her early in life, but I am certain about this, that God's mercy will accompany her always. So before she died, her sister Pauline wrote down everything she said in little snippets, 850 little statements that Therese said. And as she's dying, she said, well, I no longer find anything in books that attract me. The gospel's the only thing I'm interested in. In June, before the end of September, so we're talking about 4 months, 3 or 4 months, she had her last communion, okay? Because she threw up the host. And the priest said, well, you can't have communion anymore. Well, this was really, you'd think would be like tragic for her, who had such devotion to the Eucharist. But she said, well, there's nothing I can do about it. Everything is grace. So she really was very strong with that. And she said, I'm not a saint. I've never done the actions of a saint. I'm a very little soul that God filled with his graces, and this is what I am. She said, look at that black hole down there in the convent across the street. She said, where you cannot make anything out anymore. I'm in a hole like that, body and soul. What darkness, but I'm at peace in it. And then finally, at the end of her life, she said, well, I have no regret having given myself to love. And the last thing she said is, well, my God, I love you. So she died on September the 30th, 1897. She was buried in the town cemetery on the following Monday, October the 4th. Now, her sister, Pauline, who was the mother of the community, took these 3 manuscripts, and within a year, she edited them. And now we go back and say, well, you know, we actually got the pre-edited version, but she edited them so that there wasn't anything there that she thought would scandalize anybody. And it was a 470-page book called The Story of a Soul, and they printed 2,000 copies. And that's what made Therese famous, okay? If you have a chance to look at the cell over here, which is a replica, identical replica of her room in Lisieux, she had done some little graffiti on the side of the door. Now, one of the things I'm most fascinated with, the actual door of her cell that she walked in out of for 9 years is here in Darien. That's the door. But on the side of the door, she, in graffiti, wrote in French, you know, Jesus, you're my one and only love. Well, the sister said, this is not good. You know, we can't have the nuns putting graffiti on all the cells in the convent. So they kind of kept that quiet. But now when we look at her and say, well, it was just a sign of her great love and spirituality. Well, were any of you at the 11:30 Mass today where Father Carl had Mass? In his homily, he talked about how famous she became in World War I because the soldiers would pray to her. Well, after this edition of her Story of a Soul came out, by 1906, it was in all of these various languages. And a priest from Scotland came to the convent and said, well, you know, you ought to put up her cause for a saint. And her sisters and her brothers said, well, that's ridiculous. I mean, she was a good nun, but never going to be canonized a saint. But little did they know that by reading this autobiography, which in the end there were thousands and thousands of copies, and people realized the strength of her spirituality, that she would become so famous. So on April the 29th, 1923, Pius XI, who said that she was the star of his pontificate, beatified her, and in May of 1925 was the canonization. So that's coming up, and it'll be the 100th anniversary. When he canonized her, there were 23 cardinals, 250 bishops, 500,000 faithful showed up in Rome, only 50,000 that fit in St. Peter's Square. And then in 1997, as I said, John Paul II named her a doctor of the church. So for someone with little theological education, she was obviously inspired by the Holy Spirit. By being a doctor of the church, you can follow her spirituality, brings us closer to Jesus. Okay, this is my conclusion. Had Therese not written her memoirs and spiritual insights while in the Carmel of Lisieux, her hidden life would never have become anything but hidden in the life of the Catholic Church. Yes, Therese was a saint, but how can we explain that this young French girl who entered the Carmelite cloister at the age of 15, who had such a great love for Jesus with deep spiritual insights, and who died an unknown nun at the age of 24 after intense suffering, would become one of the most popular, well-known saints in the history of the Catholic Church? My own theory is that Therese had an intense love of Christ. We can see that, right? But making her famous, and we're all sitting here like 100 years later talking about her, that was God doing that. That's my opinion. I've never read that anywhere. But God showed his love for Therese by making her well known, so that all the aspirations of her heart to be a missionary, to be a priest, to spread the love of Christ, he made that happen because his love for her was even stronger than her love for him. So, thank you very much. Okay. I just make an announcement also, if anybody wants to receive the Sacrament of Reconciliation, there'll be confessions. Father Tom Schrader is there. You go to the very end of the hall and to the left, there's a confession. If any of you have any comments or questions, come up and see me